Perhaps following the great Chinese military general and strategist Sun Tzu's principles of war, China appears to be fighting to win the war in the mind of the adversary without firing a single bullet. That's what appears to be happening on ground, because the Chinese media has now claimed that China has moved thousands of tons of military equipment into Tibet, coming under the garb of two defense exercises held in the Tibetan plateau in recent weeks, the Chinese media claims. And this raises a question. Is this simply psychological warfare? Is China flexing its muscles amidst the Doklam standoff? Or is there reason for India to be very concerned? Now, there has been strengthening of Chinese defenses all along the line of actual control, and especially along Sikkim. Reports say that this project took place sometimes last month. It involved the movement of military hardware simultaneously by road and rail across the region, and Beijing can rapidly deploy its logistics to the border through a vast network of roads and railways. That is what China is claiming at this point of time. So let's take a look at this Pakistan-China axis. Now, is there a correlation in what's happening along the line of actual control and the line of control, the China border and the India-Pakistan line of control? Let's take a look at what's happening. So let's first talk about Doklam. That is where India came to the assistance of Bhutan's army when China unilaterally tried to violate the boundary status quo and tried to build a road in that area. India stood up for Bhutan there. So China is an aggressor. What you're seeing subsequently is China repeatedly issuing 1962 war rhetoric. July 5, that is what China did. 5 days later, India did not pull back. No statements from India. Very calmly, India standing up for Bhutan. 10th of July, China warns India, its media warns India that it can enter Jammu and Kashmir for Pakistan. Then, what's happening on the India-Pakistan front? Let's now shift focus to the line of control. Between January and June 2017, 42 ceasefire violations have taken place. In 2017, from January till date, more than 40 Jawans have been killed in action. Till the 9th of July, there had been 172 terror-related incidents. In 2017, from January to July, 42 infiltration attempts. So a big spike in infiltration attempts. I want to bring in General Deepak Kapoor, former Chief of the Army Staff, one of the foremost voices on matters military. General Kapoor, do you see a link between what's happening at the line of control and the line of actual control, sir?
Gaurav, considering the kind of coordination that the Chinese and the Pakistanis have been carrying out in the past, there is a strong possibility of a link between what is happening on the line of control and what is happening in the Doklam Plateau area.
So if these are mind games that China is playing, what's the message China is sending out?
The Chinese are playing mind games. They're also trying to build up pressure with the aim of trying to secure an area which does not belong to them, an area which is legitimately part of the Bhutanese territory, and an area which they are seeking to gain advantage and access. So they would continue with mind games, but the fact that the Indian Army has come to Bhutanese aid is a good gesture and something which they need to stand for, because India being a very large neighbor of Bhutan, it's only right that its credibility is upheld when it holds up the rights of smaller countries around it.
Okay. I want to now cut across to India Today's consulting editor, Defence, Shiv Arur. Shiv, you've been speaking to your sources in the Ministry of Defence and in the Ministry of External Affairs. What are you picking up? You know, what we get from China is an intense media blitz. They're showing us images of rockets firing, artillery firing, rapid troop deployment as they're showing troop movement. But what's the actual assessment of what's happening on ground, Shiv?
Well, pure and simple psychological operations, at least, the assessment as far as what's been happening over the last 1 month since the standoff began, Gaurav, is that the intensity of the mind games and the psychological operations has only increased. Now, this huge mobilization, the exercises that have been taking place in the Tibet area and the central provinces have taken place either, much earlier, before the standoff actually began, or only shortly thereafter. They couldn't possibly be connected in any direct way with the current standoff in the Doklam Plateau. The Indian government's assessment, as we understand it, Gaurav, is not only that these are mind games, and not only is it necessary for this entire situation to be looked at with a cool head, but also off camera, the assessment that the very fact that India actually does have a military tactical advantage in the Doklam area, the fact that the standoff has been so robust so far, is precisely why China is ratcheting up the rhetoric, talking about a confrontation along the entire line of actual control, speaking of teaching India a lesson. All of that, the psychological mind games, the unprecedented level of belligerence in the language being used by Chinese mouthpieces is actually indicative of the fact that India has an advantage, and the fact that we're standing our ground in the Doklam Plateau. So these psychological mind games we can expect to continue, but as far as the tactical picture, the tactical situation is concerned, India definitely does have an advantage.
Okay, and I want to understand this from General Deepak Kapoor. India may have a tactical advantage at the Doklam Plateau, but what about the rest of the line of actual control? What about the middle sector? What about eastern Ladakh? I'll come to that in just a moment, but as Indian troops and Chinese troops face off at the Doklam Plateau, where India is standing up for Bhutan, this issue echoed in Parliament today. The opposition tried to corner the government. It was the Samajwadi Party veteran and former Defence Minister Mulayam Singh Yadav who led the opposition charge. The former Defence Minister claimed he found reports that China was placing nuclear weapons on Pakistani soil as part of its conspiracy against India. And the former Defence Minister says that India should question the One China policy. India should help His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Lots of political reactions coming in. Let's listen in to Shashi Tharoor. We'll get you more on that story.
China has moved its equipment, the military equipment, in Tibet.
I'm not commenting right now on China. It's a sensitive issue, and I'm leaving it to the government to handle it effectively.
Isn't it a big concern that they have moved
Yes, they're all very concerned. I think every responsible Indian citizen is concerned. But, the government is conducting this. It's a very sensitive issue. I don't think there's much point in us stirring up media excitement or anxiety.
चीन हमेशा इस प्रकार से ही सभी को दबाव में धमकाकर लाकर जमीन हड़पना चाहता है। ये चीन ने अब तक सभी के साथ किया है, अब हिंदुस्तान के साथ भी पहले किया है, चाहे सियाचिन हो, लेह लद्दाख हो, अरुणाचल हो, लेकिन अभी की बात मुझे ज़्यादा गंभीर लगती है।
This is very dangerous in the sense that China has been threatening and reminding us of 1962, and then the pressure is mounting on the border. I think our Union Ministry, Home Ministry will have to be agile, and as far as these issues relating to our relations with outside, the entire opposition would be with government.
Let's quickly cut across to Beijing and bring in India Today's Anant Krishnan. Anant, is China actually preparing for a conflict? Is this muscle flexing? Are these mind games? It's a game of brinkmanship. What's happening?
Well, that's right. They do seem to be taking the brinksmanship to another level. We've had various kinds of statements, of course, relentlessly these past 2 weeks. But today, the PLA Daily and a couple of other media outlets reporting that a massive amount of equipment had been transported by road and rail. This isn't close to Sikkim, but it seems to be in northern Tibet near the Kunlun Mountains. But it is certainly muscle flexing and signaling. And what the reports were saying was that with 2 military exercises held on the Tibetan plateau in the last few weeks, that these huge transfers of logistics was done as part of these exercises. And strategic experts, in fact, told the South China Morning Post, ex-PLA officers said that in their view, this was signaling to India that, well, it's time for you to come to the negotiating table, since China had the firepower at its disposal.
Okay.
But it is a questionable tactic, given that it could very well backfire, and as well as reduce the space for de-escalation, given that China seems to be digging in its heels rather than trying to look for a compromise.
Oh, absolutely. And General Deepak Kapoor, I want to understand from you, sir. You've served extensively in the Northeast. You were 33 Corps Commander. You've been ex-Indian Army Chief. What do you make of what China is doing? Is there any fear? Is there an apprehension that perhaps this could lead to a small conflict, a short, sharp conflict? It could lead to some situation going out of hand?
Gaurav, firstly, while the Chinese may be playing mind games, there may have been exercises, there may have been coordination between the Chinese and the Pakistanis. While there may be mind games, as far as the Indian Army is concerned, it has to look at it from a practical perspective and be prepared for any eventuality finally. And to that extent, I have no doubt that Indian Army would be ready to face any eventuality. But that would, it is not being said with the aim of ratcheting up the war rhetoric, but just to say that we have to defend our territory, and to that extent, the Indian Army would equip itself pretty well.
No, but General, what I want to understand from you, sir,
coming
on the Doklam Plateau, we are tactically in a superior position, but overall, now, you know, the way Anant was just telling us that this troop movement is taking place elsewhere. China also knows that we are tactically superior at Doklam Plateau. So could they try something perhaps in the middle sector in Uttarakhand or in eastern Ladakh?
The possibility of an all-out war, Gaurav, I don't think is that strong or that great. I think it is more localized conflict which may happen close to Doklam and the area around that. So to that extent, I have no doubt that the Indian Army will be able to equip itself well. And the fact is that this aspect of all-out war, I think, is not the time for both India and China to indulge in. And diplomatically, I think over a period of time, this aspect may get resolved. The status quo which was existing prior to all this started needs to be restored, and the Chinese need to go back to what was existing earlier.
Okay.
And also there is a requirement that the Bhutanese territory which has been invaded, the Bhutanese government should also take up this issue with the United Nations.
Yes.
That they have, being a very small nation, they have been pressured against by the Chinese, who are trying to bring in military might to try and pressure.
It's a huge China, a great military giant that's bullying a very small Bhutan. But Anant, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval is traveling to Beijing for the BRICS National Security Advisors meet. Now, can something be expected there around the 25th and 27th of July?
Well, the visit of NSA Ajit Doval is going to be interesting. In fact, next week on July 26th and 27th, they're still keeping mum. The Chinese are still keeping mum on the potential for bilateral consultations. They're saying that first and foremost, this is a BRICS NSA's meeting. And in fact, when Minister of State for External Affairs VK Singh was here, there was very little in the way of bilateral engagement. The focus is very much on BRICS, so it remains to be seen. The bigger worry, of course, is publicly the Chinese are still maintaining that there's no room for diplomatic negotiations unless India withdraws, and that's their precondition. So as long as they're publicly reiterating that precondition, it's difficult to see how much there will be space for NSA Ajit Doval, who of course is also the special representative on the boundary question, to have talks with Yang Jiechi. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But as of now, the Chinese are saying it's all about the BRICS.
Okay, so this game of brinkmanship continues, but India refuses to blink, and there's breaking news that's coming in. India Today gets you the Indian assessment of the situation on ground. So the security agencies, they're very closely monitoring the situation on ground, and top sources tell India today there is no reason to be very concerned. There is no major military movement that's taking place. So no actual Chinese military movement taking place that could be termed as alarming. There is a lot of rhetoric that is coming from Chinese media. No unusual movement along the line of actual control for the past 60 days. So there are X number of troops who are already deployed, about 50,000 troops who are already deployed in this area. There is no additional deployment of troops. I want to cut across to India Today's Shiv Arur. Shiv, you've been speaking to your sources. What is the assessment? How does this all add up?
Well, this is an Indian response to the very belligerent psychological operations that China has been playing. The Indian security establishment clarifies that none of these apparently dramatic military movements that are being projected by the Chinese media have anything to do with what's happening in Doklam. In fact, many of these exercises happened quite some time ago, over 60 days ago, before the Doklam standoff began. But the videos of those exercises have been produced by Chinese media and deliberately being bombarded across their broadcast networks in an effort to play mind games like you've been reporting, Gaurav.
Yes.
So what they've been saying is that there has been no unusual military movement over the last 60 days beyond what is usually expected to maintain the many airfields there. The principal tripwires, which are the crossing of the Sang.
Yes. Shiv, stay with me for a moment. General, as former army chief, your assessment based on what the Indian army or the Indian security forces assess?
Gaurav, I feel that while there may be mind games, while there may be brinkmanship, the requirement that the Indian army should be ready for any action that may happen is important. We must stay prepared should any eventuality arise. And to that extent, I have no doubt that the Indian army is prepared. Secondly, diplomatic efforts to diffuse the crisis must continue. And like I pointed out earlier, the location where the Indian forces are holding the ground must continue to be held firmly in the China of whatever the Chinese may be saying. And finally, the Bhutanese government needs to get back to the UN to bring their attention to this particular pressure which is being used by the Chinese.
Okay, so this is a game of brinkmanship. Shiv Arur and General Deepak Kapoor, former Chief of the Army Staff, many thanks for joining me here on this special broadcast on the situation on ground at the line of actual control and the line of control. So there is no reason to panic. There is no reason to fear. These are mind games that are being played. China launching a media blitz, not backed up by actual situation on ground. At the same time, it won't take very long for Chinese to mobilize their roads, their railways, their movement, their troops, their weapons. They are in place. It would not take them very long to mobilize. At the same time, India too is prepared. Perhaps that's why negotiations the best way ahead. We will continue to track that story very closely. That is all I have time for in this India First special. Many thanks for watching.